Okay, we're going to look at an essay that does a really excellent job looking at what narration is, the nuances of it, and how it works in a particular story. I really love this essay. It is a student essay. Um, there are some things missing from it, though, too, that would improve the strength of the essay. And so we're going to look at both of those things. And this person has given us permission to look at this. So we're looking at strengths and also some growth areas. So what I'm going to do is go through this, read it out loud, and as I'm reading it, I'm going to give the feedback that I would give to this person. Um, so again, thank you, person, for allowing this to be an example of strength and also some growth areas. All right, narration in fictional writing. When it comes to the genre of fiction, there are plenty of literary elements and devices that help shape the plot and enhance the story. For instance, the use of setting, character, theme, and many more are used specifically to strengthen the story and give it depth. All right, I really like this as an opening. When we talk about hooks, I want you to make sure that everything you use as an attention getter, as an opening, is useful to your essay. So the hooks that start with like a general statement or a question or some bizarre attention getter are very juvenile. We don't want to do that. This is excellent because it goes right into what the essay is going to be about, which is the idea that fiction has elements to it, literary elements to it that drive and shape and make the plot interesting. And then we get into more detail in the second sentence, right? We get setting, character, theme, and many more to strengthen the story and give it depth. So we have shape the plot, enhance the story, strengthen the story, and give it depth. We have sort of a new layer now, right? So the plot is one thing, make the story a little bit better is another thing, but really make the story strong and then make the story deep is another thing, right? So this writer is giving us sort of layers of what these elements do, which I think is a really artful way to draw us in to a literary analysis essay. We are analyzing, in the assignment for this essay was to analyze a story, but specifically to analyze how a literary element works in that story. And we know that that's going to happen from this opening. The element that piqued my interest, however, was narration. Narration is the most interesting element to me because it's one that is encouraged each time one reads a piece, encountered each time one reads a piece of fiction, yet it is greatly overlooked. That's interesting. I think that's a good point, and I think it's true. We take our stories at face value often. So we just read the story as it's written, and we don't often sit to think, wait, why is it written in the first person or the second person or the third person, right? All right, I'm going to make a quick, let me just make sure I changed this to suggestions so this person is able to edit their work once I share it with them. Okay. It's comparable to driving the same route to work every morning. You never notice the small details until you actually take the time to step back and observe. This is similar to what I experienced when relearning narration and going more into depth about it. All right, excellent. We've got a really nice comparison. I'm going to change this to a semicolon because this is an independent clause, as is this. This is its own sentence, so we need to join those with a semicolon. All right, I want to make a note about this. You may notice that this does not follow the very stringent 5-paragraph essay, hook, background information about the story, and thesis statement, right? Instead, we have this really artful opening that draws the reader into this idea of narration. We have a really beautiful metaphor or analogy that the writer gives us about what noticing narration is, right? And we have sort of a context for narration. I really like this. So when I give you the outline to a 5-paragraph essay, I don't want you to I want you to follow the outline if you have nothing else to hold on to. But again, it's a skeleton and everyone has a skeleton, but all of our bodies look different because the way that the flesh is on our skeleton, the way that our muscles develop, the way that our bone structure is different for every person. It's the same thing with an essay. So what we have here is an excellent intro to narration, and that doesn't have to be the introduction to the story yet, right? So I want you to, the reason I wanted to use this essay as an example is because it follows structure beautifully while also breaking out of that mold of the 5-paragraph essay. As a child, narration was only explained as the voice of the story and how it can either be a first person, second person, or third person account. All right, this is a this is a small mistake here, right? So as a child, narration, this is like basically a dangling modifier. So it's more of actually a dangling noun. But so as a child, narration was only explained as the voice. What we need is as a child, what we need to do is to change this because it seems like as a child refers to narration. Or is defining narration. So when narration was a child, it was only explained as the voice. That's not what the author means, right? So here's an example of how we could fix that. Oops. When I was a child, narration was only explained to me as the voice of the story and how it could either be first person, second person, or third person account. We're going to need there we go. But as a college student, I learned, need a little comma here. I learned that narration plays a bigger role than what once initially taught. I want to say that the writer probably meant than what I was initially taught. Narration is less about how the story is being told and more about why it is being told in that way and how the point of view used can greatly benefit the story. Okay? So this is not exactly... There's a beautiful, beautiful blue jay eating all the seeds of my basil on the balcony. And it's really loud. Sorry. Okay, so this is not quite the thesis statement of the entire piece yet, but it's getting us ready for the thesis statement. So we know that the author is going to talk to us about how narration and point of view enhances and the story and kind of clarifies the story, right? There are some ways that we could make this little section of writing a little more concise. When I was a child, narration was, we don't need it only, was explained, we can get rid of only, was explained to me as being the voice of the story. Let's put a period here. And let's go ahead and say the voice or narration of the story could be either first person, second person, or third person. Oh, let's go back and add that A back in. A first person, we need an A here, a second person, or a third person account. But as a college student, I learned could either, yeah, we need to get rid of that. Okay. This is a little hard to do live. First person, a second person, or a third person account. But as a college student, I learned that narration plays a bigger role than what I was initially taught. Narration is less about how the story is being told and more about why it is being told in that way and how the point of view used can greatly benefit the story. This is one of those, greatly vary. It's just kind of like, sure, but we don't need it. We don't need to say greatly benefit. Benefit enriches the story. We don't need to say how much it enriches the story, really. We can get rid of that. The story I decided to analyze in order to explore the importance of narration and the way it can positively impact the plot is The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. The beginning of The Secret Life of Walter Mitty starts off fast-paced and dives the reader straight into a scene of chaos where there's a lot of action happening and talks of commanders and lieutenants and other warlike language. I think we need a different word than dives because I can dive, but I can't, no one can make me dive, right? So I want to say maybe throws the reader straight into a scene of chaos. There's probably a stronger word, so writer of this essay, if you want to choose a different word, but just make sure it's a word that makes sense because, again, I can't dive you, you dive, I throw, right? But you can choose a different word as long as it makes sense. Okay, so we've got this little bit of, now we're getting the intro. So up here, like I said, it kind of breaks not the rule at all. It still is organized. It's still following, it's still unified under one overarching single idea, right? We know we're going to talk about narration. We know the author is going to talk about how narration impacts the plot of the story, right? Particularly how the narration in this. Now we're getting an intro to the story. And I really like that the author separated these two things out. I like that this is not following the traditional outline I gave while also still having the bones in place. All right, the story I decided to analyze. We already did that. We did that. Based off of the first scene and given the title of the story, I'd initially believed I had the plot of the story figured out already. This could be more concise. You could say, I initially believed I knew the plot of the story already. I was under the impression that the secret life of whoever Walter Mitty was had to do with him being some kind of commander, and him for some reason having to keep that part of his life a secret. Again, we could work on concision here. Let me just highlight this for the author. I'm just going to leave a note, could be more concise. So you'll notice in your essays, folks, that sometimes I give you suggestions, and sometimes I give you an actual example of how you could change it, and sometimes I say, hey, you could do this thing differently, and it's up to you to figure out how to do it. As we advance as writers, and as I get to know your voices, the stronger you are, the more I'm just going to say, fix this, and you decide how to fix it. If I think you need more support, I will always give you an example. However, I'm suddenly brought back to reality within the next couple of sentences when Walter's wife cuts in and comments on how fast Walter is unconsciously driving. Once this happens, it is then revealed that Walter isn't a commander in a compromising, war-related situation. He's just an ordinary man driving his wife into town. All right, this is an example. It is then revealed is an example of passive voice. We want to avoid passive voice. Passive voice is not an error in your writing necessarily, but it's not as strong as active voice, and we want our writing to be concise and strong as possible at all times, right? So once this happens, it is then revealed. What we can say is, once this happens, the narrator reveals that Walter ... Because we're talking about narration, right? So why not say the narrator reveals? Because that's who's revealing it. This then caused me to question why Walter would imagine such a thing in the first place. So now we're getting into the reader's head through what the writer is saying. We're getting into the writer of this essay's head as they were reading, which is an interesting way to look at literary analysis. As the story progresses, there are many other times where he would once again ask himself to star in his own drastic soap opera. I think maybe the word they wanted was dramatic, but I don't know. So I'm going to say, did you mean dramatic? Drastic works, but not quite as well as dramatic there. Like the scenarios where he's the person running the show, calling the shots. With the story constantly switching between reality and make-believe, it's hard to tell why Walter does this, and that is due to the kind of narration used in the story. So this is an interesting intro. It's a bit of a long paragraph, but I think it works. What we're doing is getting introduced to the story through the writer's impression and understanding of the story, right? And then we're landing in this place of now the writer is going to reveal to us how narration works in the story. They're leading up to this. And really, our central idea is the story is switching between reality and make-believe, and we don't know why Walter's doing it. And that's because of the narration. So the way that narration is impacting the plot for this writer is that the plot keeps us kind of in suspense and really suspended between two worlds, reality and make-believe, and the narration makes that possible. And they're going to go into depth about why that is. Now, this is an introduction, so you don't necessarily, it's an introduction to the story, right? So you don't necessarily need text evidence, but there's a lot of opportunities where this person could have pulled in text evidence if they wanted to. And we'll see as we go forward that there is no text evidence in here. So this is one of the things I was talking to you about. Like, some folks had essays that were pretty weak and really, really needed that text evidence. This person does a great job of summarizing the examples that support their thinking and the writing is really strong, but they lack text evidence, and that costs them points, right? So we really do need to make sure that we have text evidence, and we'll look through as we continue through the body paragraphs about where the opportunities for that would be for the person to integrate that. The use of narration in the story is particularly interesting due to it not being straightforward as most readers are used to. All right, so this is a pretty complex topic sentence, but this is our topic sentence here. We're going to learn about how the narration is not straightforward. So up here in what we could kind of call part of our thesis statement, we have the narration allows us to switch from reality to make-believe. And then our next our topic sentence, we've got that's because it is not straightforward narration. First, let's discuss what the most basic form of narration is in the story. It is being told from Walter's perspective, yet it is not him directly telling the story. Great. So now we get a definition of the kind of narration. Excellent. It is an unidentified outside source telling the story, which is evident through the use of he, she, they when discussing the characters. Excellent. So we call that third person. More specifically, the narration in The Secret Life of Walter Mitty is an example of what's known as limited third-person narration, or a limited third-person narrator. This point of view focuses solely on one character and only their thoughts are revealed. We as the readers are able to access Walter's thoughts and imagination and get to experience what he goes through as it happens, and we get to see the consequences of those actions as well. So because it's a limited third-person narrator, we do see through his eyes and see his thoughts. We have access to the inside of his head, but because it's not only through his eyes, we also have access to people outside of him noticing him and what the consequences for that are, because we're watching it, not through his eye. We're seeing his thoughts, but we're seeing the world around him as well. So this writer does a great job explaining all of that in this paragraph. Still, I don't think there would be a necessity for necessarily text evidence here, but let's see where we could put it in. While Walter Mitty is not the direct narrator of the story, he still plays a significant role in the narration. Walter, again, so now we have another supporting point. Walter is considered the central consciousness. Again, this writer has such a clear understanding of narration, and the assignment for this essay was to really show me that you understood a story and you understood how a literary element was working within that story. That's why this is a strong essay, in spite of the growth areas like needing to pull in text evidence. He still plays, tiny little typo here, he still plays a significant role in the narration. Walter is considered the central consciousness where he is the focal character, meaning that while the story does have other characters, it is his thoughts and actions that are the primary focus. Walter being the central consciousness works in the story because the reader gets to form their opinion on him or about him. It gets the reader to analyze deeper why Walter escapes reality so frequently and why he imagines himself in the position he does. I think this should be a new paragraph. There's a possibility that it could be easier to understand why Walter does these things he does in the story if the story was told from his perspective. But the use of the third-person narration helps the reader to understand the whole story rather than just Walter's version. Excellent. For example, if the story were to be told in the first person, there would be a chance that the reader runs into the unreliable narrator. That is the first-person narrator who can shape the story to their will, mainly with the intentions of deceiving the reader. In regard to this story, if the first-person narration was used, Walter could easily lie about his reasoning as to why he is such a daydreamer in order to keep his real reasoning a secret. Through third person, however, it is impossible for Walter to cover up his mistakes, which helps show that he's only human and can't help himself when he gets into his imaginative episodes. So all of this is great thinking. What we're missing here is an example of the imaginative episodes. We have a summary of it in our earlier, what I would call, introduction to the story, after our introduction to narration. But what we really need is a strong body paragraph after, say, this one, that really gives us an example of what this writer is talking about. Through the use of third person, we are able to get all sides of the story. For instance, when daydreaming once again, Walter is so into his imagination that he doesn't notice that he's driven into an exit-only section of the parking lot. What could we put here? The text. A quotation from the text. He is brought back to reality by the parking lot attendant who corrects him, and Walter is left embarrassed and slightly annoyed that he was caught in such a compromising position, especially when seconds prior he was a well-respected surgeon in his mind. Excellent summary of the piece, right? Because the writer is telling us that Walter's embarrassed, right? What we need before this is a piece of evidence. So that would enhance this essay 20-fold. Parking lot attendant interjecting into the story adds some perspective into how the world doesn't just stop because he falls into his daydream states. Again, now we're going into interpretation. Excellent interpretation, in fact. The This writer is telling us what's happening, analyzing how Walter's feeling, and then interpreting how this external character of the parking lot attendant, who we only know because of the narration that's chosen by James Thurber for this piece, right? Really shows us the instability of Walter's mind, right? So we've got analysis of the text, interpretation, and going back to this thesis statement that narration really shapes the plot by showing us the difference between reality and make-believe in Walter's mind. So really great thinking, really great intellectual work, just missing some structural elements like text evidence. Ultimately, the bigger picture in Walter's case is that he's an aging, misunderstood man who longs for something more and uses his imagination as a way to cope and escape from his reality. And I'm able to confidently come to the conclusion based on the third person narration used. Again, I'd like to see some evidence of this, maybe even this point pulled out into a new paragraph. It fits in this paragraph, but we could go further into that point. We could go into more depth. This is why the use of the narration is important when it comes to a fictional story. The way the story is being told matters just as much as why it's being told. The narrator helps the reader understand Walter on a more personal level by being his eyes and ears, and yet not overlooking his flaws. Okay, so excellent advanced writing, excellent advanced thinking. What this piece is missing, I would say that this writer could work on making their thesis statement slightly clearer, like slightly more emphatic and clearer, and a little bit more centralized at the beginning of the essay. What's interesting about this essay is we have the major elements we need. For instance, thesis statement, topic sentences, context, the definition of the literary element is really thorough. We've got some great background information about the story. We have all those pieces, right? We've got some excellent analysis and interpretation. So we have all those pieces of an essay, right? But they're kind of scattered throughout the essay. However, there's nothing disorganized about this essay. So this person has mastered organization and structure to such an extent that they're able to break up the pieces that are needed to make a literary analysis essay and kind of distribute them and weave them together artfully throughout the whole thing. What they are missing is the text evidence. The text evidence is essential and does need to be put into this part. Well, I mean, the person can choose if they want to rewrite or not, but if they chose to rewrite, that's the thing that I would need them to focus on. But in order to do that well without extending the piece and making this essay way longer, they might have to rearrange a couple things. That'll be up to them. But I wanted you to see what it looks like to artfully, successfully, and thoroughly define a literary element or an element of literature in the context of a story and really show how the story works with that thing. This person does that nearly perfectly. As far as essays go, we're missing some essential pieces. I also wanted you to see a really effective use of the first person pronouns. This person is using first person really artfully. You don't have to entirely avoid first person when you're doing a literary analysis essay, and not as far as I'm concerned. Other teachers may have different opinions, but even in your book, there's first person pronouns in some of the example essays. We're going to go on to an example essay from the book right now, which I don't think is very good, but it has some strong pieces or parts to it. But you also notice this person is not saying, I think, I believe, in my opinion, right? They're really just showing their thinking. They're not saying that they think something. They're not making unnecessary announcements because they know that we know that they are the person writing, and so these are their ideas. I guess I should probably conclude this because otherwise it will be super, super long. The other thing that's missing, of course, is we're excited. But other than that, this was a strong piece. Other than that and the lack of context, this was a strong piece. So that's that for now, and I will be back in a second with more analysis of a different essay.